For more than 20 years, developers have been writing CSS in almost the exact same way. We create a style sheet, define classes, and slowly add more and more styles as the project grows. At first, it feels clean and organized. You might start with simple classes like backquote, card backquote, backquote, header backquote, or backquote, button backquote. But as the project grows, things begin to change. New features are added, deadlines get tighter, different developers start contributing to the same codebase. Suddenly, you start seeing class names like backquote, product card inner final backquote, backquote, header new v2 backquote, or backquote, temporary fix backquote. And here's the real problem, nobody wants to delete old CSS. Because what if that class is still used somewhere? This creates what developers call CSS append-only syndrome. Instead of cleaning old code, developers just keep adding more and more styles. Over time, the style sheet becomes massive, sometimes thousands of lines long. The result: slower development, harder maintenance, and a growing fear of touching the CSS at all. But what if there was a different approach? That's where Tailwind CSS comes in. Traditional CSS separates structure from styling. Your HTML defines the layout, and your CSS file defines how everything looks. In theory, that sounds clean. But in reality, it creates context switching. A developer constantly jumps between HTML and CSS files just to style a single component. You write HTML, switch to CSS, create a class, go back to HTML, test it, go back again. This constant switching interrupts something developers value deeply: flow state. Tailwind introduces a completely different philosophy called utility-first CSS. Instead of creating custom classes, you use small, reusable utility classes directly in your HTML. For example, instead of writing CSS like this, you simply write, each class represents a single styling rule. Backquote flex backquote controls layout. Backquote pt4 backquote controls padding. Backquote text center backquote controls alignment. This may look unusual at first, but it has a huge advantage. Developers stay in one file, inside the HTML, without constantly switching context. Engineering teams using Tailwind often report 30% to 50% faster development time because of this workflow. One reason Tailwind is rapidly emerging is the engineering behind its newest versions. In version 4, Tailwind introduced a completely new engine called Oxide. This engine is written in Rust, a language known for its extreme performance and memory safety. Why does this matter? Because Tailwind doesn't ship a giant CSS file anymore. Instead, it generates only the CSS you actually use. If your HTML uses backquote flex backquote, backquote pt4 backquote, and backquote text center backquote, Tailwind generates only those styles. Nothing else. This dramatically reduces CSS bundle size and improves performance. But the real magic is build speed. Tailwind's new engine can rebuild styles in around 200 microseconds. That's faster than most developers can even notice. From the developer's perspective, the rebuild feels instant. There's no waiting, no refreshing, and no interruption to the workflow. In practice, this means the CSS compilation step almost disappears from the development process. Another major reason Tailwind is rising so quickly is the explosion of AI-assisted development. Large language models, like those used in modern coding assistants, are incredibly good at generating code. But they struggle with one thing: custom CSS systems. Every developer names their classes differently. One project might use backquote, card container backquote. Another might use backquote, dashboard panel backquote. Another might use backquote, panel wrapper backquote. To an AI model, that inconsistency is confusing. But Tailwind changes that. Because Tailwind has a standardized design language. Classes like backquote flex backquote, backquote grid backquote, backquote bg blue 500 backquote, and backquote rounded XL backquote always mean the same thing across projects. That consistency makes Tailwind extremely easy for AI tools to generate. In fact, many AI code generators today automatically output Tailwind by default. In a way, Tailwind has become a shared language between AI and browsers. If developers adopt Tailwind, AI tools can assist much more effectively with UI development. If they don't, they may actually be making AI tools less useful. Another strength of Tailwind is that it doesn't try to replace the browser. Instead, it works with modern browser features. For example, modern CSS now supports container queries, allowing components to respond to the size of their parent container rather than just the screen. Tailwind integrates these features directly into its utilities. Another example is modern color systems like OKLCH, which allow designers to create more consistent and visually balanced color palettes. But perhaps the most important improvement is something called cascade layers. In traditional CSS, developers often fight something called the specificity war. One style overrides another, then another overrides that. Eventually, developers resort to important just to force styles to work. Tailwind avoids this problem by using native CSS cascade layers, which organize styles in a predictable order. The result is cleaner, more maintainable styling. Tailwind also supports logical properties, which replace direction-specific styles. For example, instead of writing !margin left!, developers can use !margin inline start!. This makes websites automatically compatible with languages written right to left, like Arabic or Hebrew. In other words, Tailwind helps developers build globally adaptable interfaces. Of course, Tailwind is not without criticism. One of the most common complaints is that the HTML looks messy. Some components may contain 15 or even 20 classes inside a single element. Critics argue that this looks similar to inline styling. But there's an important difference. Inline styles allow developers to use any value they want. Tailwind does not. Tailwind enforces a design system. Developers must choose from predefined spacing scales, color palettes, and typography rules. Instead of random colors like #3478 FA developers use consistent tokens like blue 500 This ensures that every component in a large project follows the same visual language. For teams with dozens, or even hundreds, of developers, that consistency is extremely powerful. Tailwind is emerging not just as a framework, but as a new philosophy for writing CSS. Instead of treating CSS as a static document that grows over time, Tailwind treats it more like a compiled language, generated dynamically based on what your project actually needs. It connects design systems, developer productivity, and modern browser capabilities into a single workflow. And as AI-assisted development continues to grow, that workflow becomes even more powerful. Because sometimes, the best CSS is the CSS you never have to write.